right, welcome everyone. It is 4 p.m. here on Thursday the 18th. We're going to go ahead and give it a few minutes for folks to go ahead and log in. But while we wait, I'm going to welcome you and talk about some of our upcoming content from the U.S. Green Building Council, Los Angeles. The event today that we have is one of our quarterly thought leadership series. We started this last year to really help raise awareness around issues that probably weren't getting the attention that they needed, and help talk about commitments we could make on a local level across the value chain to try to make progress. So as you'll see today, we're going to have a lot of different speakers. They have a small amount of time to speak, but the goal is that we really get everyone's perspective across the value chain on an issue. And so we hope you enjoy the content today. Speaking of content, we've been very busy over here in virtual reality or our new reality or whatever you want to call it. At this point, we're having about 2 to 3 events a week. Earlier today, we had a webinar on construction and demolition waste. We have training coming up around LEED. We have some virtual happy hours on healthy materials and for our Women in Green group. In July, we're going to start the first part of our True Zero Waste and Circular Economy training, as well as have another one of our virtual tours, which has been a very successful format for us. You'd actually be surprised. I feel like you learn more about a building in some ways in doing a virtual tour than you do in actually being there in person, although there's no substitute for actually being there. They've been a great way to see a space, and for that mechanical room you could never fit more than 5 people into. You'd be surprised. You can get a couple hundred people into that mechanical room pretty easily. Also wanted to mention our talent portal. We launched this the first week of March, so right before the pandemic really took center attention for everyone. But we really designed this to be a hub for us here in the region for jobs, employers, upcoming training, recorded content. So please check it out. We really try to focus on people here. We have a mentor network that's connected to the portal as well. So we'd love for you to check it out. If you have any jobs, you can shoot posting. And there's a lot of people out there who are interested right now. We also have a number of committees. So our committees are really groups that connect once a month and really collaborate on how to make progress on issues that are important to them. So whether it's our building decarb group, our construction group, we have a group that's doing great work around green schools, our Women in Green group that I mentioned earlier. And then we have a legacy project, which is a community project we do every year. Our members and volunteers literally build out something in the community. This year, we're doing a rooftop aeroponic garden in a church south of the 10 freeway. It's a pretty amazing project. It's going to function as a prison reentry program to teach people how to grow food. And we're going to have some volunteer days later this summer, and really hope that you can come out. And it's just a beautiful project and really speaks to a lot of the issues around resilience and equity that we need to be talking about more right now. I would be remiss if I did not mention our Municipal Green Building Conference and Expo. Other than having one of the longest names for a conference here in Southern California, this is the 19th year, believe it or not, for this event. This year we had planned on moving it to downtown to LA Trade Tech, and we're going to have it in May. Obviously, we're all dealing with being flexible in our work lives right now, and we moved that back to August, and we're doing it virtually. We've also added a community day this year, so we're really looking to engage the public in the green building conversation. Really provide them with information on what they can do in their own homes and their own lives to reduce their carbon footprint or just be more sustainable in general. And we also want to make it a little bit fun. So we're looking to have some music, do some virtual tours, and mix things up a little bit. So we hope you can join us. So our agenda today, as you'll see, I'm going to hand things over here in a moment to Katie Fehrenbacher with GreenBiz, who's going to help frame our discussion today. Then we're going to dive into some smaller sub-panels to talk about policy, grid, and buildings. And then we'll have some time for audience Q&A. Typically, we like to lay out some next steps and commitments at the end of these events. A commitment could just be agreeing to talk again. It doesn't need to be that big of a commitment. But we do really want to focus on what we do between events, not just the events themselves. And then if you're part of our laser group, we're going to have a breakout session afterwards for some one-on-one connection. You may be wondering, what is LASER? It is not a focus beam of light. It is the LA Sustainability Executives Roundtable, another great acronym. We're really good with acronyms over here, which is really meant to provide a venue for corporate sustainability executives to connect with each other and talk about the issues they deal with in the corporate ESG world. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. So you'll see here, we've got a wide range of perspectives ranging from utility to energy storage to contractors to labor. I'm really excited. You know, I feel like for each one of these that we put together, I learned way more than I thought I would, and I find that the folks who are speaking together actually learn from each other and connect in new and different ways. And so I'm really excited for our conversation. And with that, before we start, I just wanted to note that you know, we provide most of this content either free or at very low cost. So if you feel inspired, you like what we're putting out there, please donate by texting GREEN to 707070. You know, this is a hard time for everyone. You know, we're obviously in the midst of a recession. It's going to be a while for all of us. It's important we stick together. We want to keep providing educational content and helping to elevate our region. So please take some time to support us if you can. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Katie. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of a green biz consumer of content. I do read Katie's emails, not all of them, Katie, but I do read some of them on a weekly basis. And I'm really excited we could have her here today to help frame the topic for us. Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. All right. Is that working for you guys? Let's see. Present. There we go. All right. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you, but it's still white on my end.
Still white on your end?
We don't see the presentation.
Your screen sharing is paused. Let's see. Resume share. You see it now? Let's see. If not, I can pull up.
We did for a second.
Okay. If not, I can pull up my slides.
If you want, I can just go back to the slides I had, and you can just tell me next if you want.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. You see that now?
I can see it. I can see slides.
Fantastic. Here's your first slide.
Excellent. Thank you.
Just say next when you want to go.
Thank you, Ben. Well, great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to speak to you all today. I really appreciate the chance to speak to a group doing such important work around helping to scale EV infrastructure, which is a super important and very interesting and timely topic right now. I really wanted to frame this conversation at a high level around where we are now in terms of both electric transportation, but also cleaner transportation, and how the pandemic and recession have changed things or not changed things, and then look a little more deeply at some of the challenges and opportunities around EV charging in particular. Next slide, please. So this is a shot of me interviewing Mary Nichols last year. This is winter, late October 2019. And at this moment in time, I was really thinking kind of where were we at the end of 2019 in terms of the EV industry and clean transportation. And I remember talking to her and thinking, you know, really one of the biggest problems we're facing right now is things like the Trump administration's potential rollback of the auto emission standards. So things like that. And I think the week before our event, this is at our Verge 19 event that we held in Oakland last year. I think the week before, The Guardian had the headline that 2020 was going to be the year of the electric vehicle. You know, cities across Europe spent the year looking to ban fossil fuels from urban centers. You know, the big automakers were set to offer more than 400 alternative fuel vehicles by the end of 2020. Tesla had shipped 367,500 vehicles in 2019, kind of meeting Elon Musk's annual sales target. Next slide. And so, you know, did that happen? Well, you know, yes and no. I think we kind of all know what happened here. This is a picture of the commute, March 2020, March 22nd, 2020. And so, you know, COVID-19 has changed transportation fundamentally, both in the current time period, but also in a broader scale. And so that's some of the things I've been thinking about in my work. How is it changing clean transportation and the electric vehicle industry? So obviously transportation, was shut down across modes. Vehicle transportation plummeted. The aviation halted, oil prices in some cases went negative. But beyond just the shelter in place and the lockdown and people not physically moving, the global recession that is here upon us is going to change things for the EV industry in particular. Next slide, please. And one of the things I think about a lot is, how do we do clean transportation when public transportation is really in a crisis right now, and will be so for the next, probably year or two, both financially and just a crisis of safety and confidence by its ridership. So next slide, please. And so what does that mean for kind of the EV industry? I guess in the short term, the EV sales of passenger sales look pretty grim right now. The pandemic and recession is leading to a considerable drop. So I think Wood Mackenzie estimated that EV sales were going to drop by 43% globally this year. So that's a huge drop. Automakers, I think you've all been following the news, but they've been really pummeled by the pandemic in terms of shutting down production, but also, doing layoffs. And quite a few number of them have delayed some of their EV launches. So, is 2020 still the big year for EV sales? Probably not. 2020 is not going to be the breakout EV sales year that everyone was hoping that it would be. Next slide, please. But the short-term kind of grim outlook is actually just the kind of first layer, and the long-term outlook for EVs is much, much better, and is actually really inspiring and exciting. So you probably all follow these, but the lithium-ion battery pack prices fell 87% between 2010 and 2019, and they're expected to continue to fall at a rapid rate below $100 per kilowatt hour by 2024. So very soon, electric vehicles with their battery prices will be at price parity with internal combustion vehicles. A lot of those cost reductions are due to just the maturation of the industry. So this is VW's plant. Larger automakers are investing, billions of dollars into this. The battery plants are getting a lot bigger. So through economy of scale and manufacturing techniques and innovation, they're lowering the costs of batteries and EVs. And automakers, so VW has already committed more than 140 billion to electrify in their capital costs. So those types of commitments are not going to go away with a short-term pandemic and a drop of passenger EV sales. So electrification is not going anywhere. Next slide, please. In particular, there's some bright spots in the short term. One of those is electric trucks and buses. Cities and big companies, shipping providers like UPS, FedEx, Amazon, IKEA, they're all looking really hard at electric delivery vehicles and electric trucks. It's all very exciting. Electric transit buses. I think people are following the California mandate that says all transit buses need to be zero emissions starting in 2029, I think it is. And so that's very exciting and kind of moving the market in terms of commercial zero emission vehicles. Next slide, please. And clean transportation isn't just about electrification. So that's one of the things we're looking at is when transportation is coming back after the pandemic, what is this going to look like? And so cities are trying to embrace rebuilding transportation when there isn't a confidence in public transportation, and can they optimize around other non-personal owned vehicles? And so, scooters has emerged as one area that could potentially be one tool used. There are a variety, bikes are, I think everyone's seen bike sales have been dramatic over the past 3 months. Bike sharing has gone up increasingly in urban centers. Next slide, please. And so we're looking at how we can build back without relying on personal owned vehicles. And this is a map of the city of Oakland, and this is their Slow Streets project, where they close down the streets to through traffic. And so other cities like San Francisco, Seattle are creating these types of spaces as well for bikes, scooters, or just people walking. And so things like this we hope that will stick after the pandemic. Next slide, please. And so I think everyone's big hope through the COVID-19 is that, this is LA with beautiful air. I know a lot of you guys live there. I'm up in San Francisco. And, that the clean air and lower emissions will really galvanize people around building back better around zero emission transportation opportunities. Next slide, please. And so I want to talk just for my last few minutes about EV charging infrastructure specifically. It's estimated that by 2030, more than 13 million charging stations will be needed to support the US EV market. And today there's approximately 200,000 EV chargers deployed. That's metrics from Blink Charging. So basically, based on the 2030 estimate, less than 1% of the necessary charging infrastructure exists out there. So this is a huge opportunity, but also a very big challenge. RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, puts building out public charging infrastructure as an urgent priority and one of the #1 things to help deliver clean transportation. Next slide, please. So what are some of the big challenges with EV charging right now? One of them is utility rates and demand charges. I know we've got representatives from utilities on the session today, but demand charges have gotten in the way of some of the early deployments for commercial vehicles, but also public charging, fast DC public charging. So we need new innovative rate tools from utilities to make charging EVs economical and easy for consumers and for companies and organizations. We need open networks that can help scale, secure and private, but open networks that can help scale EV charging and create platforms that are a lot more user-friendly for drivers. If you follow RMI, they put out a really interesting report about lowering the soft costs of EV charging. And so it's similar in the way that the solar industry was facing really high soft costs. So that's things that are not involved in the installation of the infrastructure. So like marketing and sales or permitting and things like that. So RMI is saying that EV charging is facing a similar issue with really high soft costs, and that there's going to be a close attention to try to reduce those costs over the next few years to make EVs and EV charging a lot more economical. In addition, EVs can be used in really interesting ways to unlock economic value for utilities, for consumers, for companies. So as the industry matures and there more and more vehicles get out there and more chargers get out there, we'll see some really interesting ways to do vehicle-to-grid technologies, use vehicles as battery banks, do peak shaving, things like that, where just the EVs can help maintain the reliability on the grid. So I think that's a super exciting area. Next slide, please. And innovation is going to play, a really key role. This is the Mobi Charger, a Silicon Valley company, and they created this distributed mobile charger for some cities, but also companies that want to do charging at their places, but they don't want to invest in putting in the hard asset of the infrastructure. So I think there'll be a really interesting way for technology companies to play a role in creating new innovation, and particular software and digital technologies can be used to manage smart charging really effectively. New startups are building things like fleets as a service, Amply Power or EIQ Mobility. That's become a really hot space right now. And next slide, please. And I think for the charging to really scale in a public way, we're going to need really big companies involved. Shell, paying itself as an energy company, is starting to get into the EV charging space. And I think we're going to need a lot more really large companies doing that, because EV charging is a industry that has a low margin for the charging provider. So I think we need these really large scale companies to come in and help deploy this type of technology. And the future of EV charging, I think, are going to have just a few other kind of key challenges. We need to make sure that everyone can access the EV vision. So multifamily dwellings, renters. I'm a renter in San Francisco. I can't really imagine charging an EV without a garage and a place to charge it in. There's no reliable public chargers in a few blocks from me. So we need to make sure that there's different ways, whether that's using innovation or policies or incentives, to bring everybody into this EV vision, and make sure that everyone is included and can have access to this. And finally, there's just so many really interesting things happening around EV charging in terms of market opportunities. Yesterday, if you were watching the news, Lyft announced that they were going to go 100% EVs by 2030. And so announcements like that can really galvanize the deployment of chargers in really interesting ways by charging companies, but also creating new partnerships and also encouraging policy. So I'm really excited to see things like that come to light and really excite people. So those are some of my remarks about EV charging and clean transportation in general. And be sure to check out greenbiz.com is our website, but we also have an event called Verge, which is going to be all digital this year in the last week in October. So come to our website and check it out. And I'm planning all the transportation related content about that. So thank you so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to the panel talks.
Thank you, Katie. I really appreciate you helping to frame this conversation for us. And, one of the things that really led to this discussion today, here at USGDCLA, we're an independent nonprofit, really focused on accelerating sustainability in the built environment for the region. And, for the last year now, I've been hearing just increasing murmurs from, our owner partners that have large portfolios, really struggling with trying to get more EV-ready charging stalls in their parking lots, as they try to get above having onesie, twosie chargers or 1 or 2% of their parking, hitting big infrastructure problems with being able to make that happen. And I felt like this was an important issue for us to address from a green building perspective. Electrification plays an important part in that. And then typically for these events, we break down the conversation into a couple sub-panels. This was kind of a tough one to break down. So here we ended up landing on policy, grid, and buildings. We're going to hand out things over to our speakers here in a moment. But I think in particular on this issue, everything's connected, and no pun intended, that is even more true around EV charging. This is something that's going to take just a lot of coordination and collaboration to really move forward. So with that, we're going to dive into the policy part of our conversation today. Each of our speakers is going to take 2 minutes to just introduce themselves and talk about their role on the issue around EV charging infrastructure. And then we're going to jump into some questions for this subpanel before moving to the next one. So Andrew, you're up first.
Sure, thanks. Hi, my name is Andrew Gruey. I'm a vice president with AECOM. I lead innovative transportation technology and transportation electrification for North America. For those of you who don't know, AECOM is an LA-based company, infrastructure company that designs and builds infrastructure globally. And then I think importantly for this conversation, we're a leader in both transportation and energy infrastructure. My role over the past 2 years has been how new emerging technologies will impact the planning, design, and construction of infrastructure in the future, and support infrastructure owners who are integrating these technologies. So electrification is a very large part of that. Beyond my role at AECOM, I'm extremely passionate about electrification of transportation. It's been a personal passion of mine for quite a few years. I was fortunate enough to sit on the board of Bellows, the California-based nonprofit supporting electrification of 5 million vehicles by 2030, which was formed by Mary Nichols, who was mentioned earlier, during its inception year. And I continue to support many of those efforts in California and specifically in my home of Los Angeles. And I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about policy.
Jen?
Hi, had to unmute myself. We were joking earlier. I'm a 46-year-old person on the call, so I'm not always the most technologically adept. My name is Jennifer Kropke. I'm an attorney. I have the privilege of working for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 11, and the National Electrical Contractors Association. I work on behalf of the 12,000 electrical workers here in LA County alone and the over 400 electrical contractors. If you've been to City of Los Angeles and you've ever plugged into an EV charger in the City of LA, you've probably plugged into one of the chargers that our contractors and electricians installed. We did all of the EV charging for Mayor Garcetti's police, fire, and municipal. We're also very involved not only in that segment, but also we're getting very involved in the goods movement sector. We were involved in Volvo Light Series 1. So we are very excited about all of this electrification. That's my day job, talking about electrification of everything as we joke. And very excited to be here and wanted to thank Ben for putting this on. So great to work with you. And this is such an exciting thing to talk about today. Thanks.
Thank you. Allison? Going once, Allison? I know we have you here. Are you on mute? You might be on mute.
Mute.
There
That
you
helps,
go.
right? Okay,
Yep.
sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah, so my name is Allison Linder. Hello, everyone. I'm a transportation planner at Southern California Association of Governments. And SCAG is a regional transportation planning agency. We set policy for transportation and land use at a very high level. We have about 160 cities in our region covering 6 counties in Southern California. So with that, we have, great outreach to all the cities and elected officials and their jurisdictions, great mapping and modeling tools. And we have been kind of focused on EVs, both kind of across the board. My personal focus is in goods movement. And then we also have on the passenger side and on the transit side. And just a tiny bit about my background. I did my graduate work at USC, focusing on corporate environmental responsibility at the port. So that kind of gave me a strong background in air quality and transportation, which I bring to my role at SCAG. I'm mostly focused on mitigating goods movement impacts and equity issues in terms of advanced technologies, as well as sustainability issues, and kind of a new area that's been emerging over the past couple of years of last mile delivery. I would also say I'm kind of been thinking about EVs from a full life cycle perspective, and want to kind of close the loop just in terms of the after effects. And I've recently started, I'm now sitting on the California EPA's Committee on Electric Vehicle Battery Recycling. So not only do we want to think about how to deploy the vehicles, we want to think about their end life too. And I'll turn it over to the panel.
Thank you, Allison. Katie, I'm not going to have you introduce yourself twice. Don't worry about it. We'll just dive into the discussion. So my first question for the group here, and maybe we'll start with you, Andrew, and we'll move through the other panelists, is what is the one policy change, if you could pick just one, that you think would have the biggest impact on accelerating the implementation of new infrastructure and accelerating EV adoption?
Sure. I think one thing you can look at is just kind of statistics. Berkeley put together this PEV policy rubric, and what came out of that was California scores the highest in terms of policy when it comes to EVs, except for when it comes to EV charger installation. So, that's pretty telling. And I think what came out of that was really that there's not a lot of transparency and availability of how the policy is in terms of funding for EVSE installations, and it's highly unpredictable on a year-to-year basis. So I think really, if you were to provide better details on the incentives, the applicability, be able to better predict how the funding is going to be from year to year, and really, try to encourage the public and the private to leverage a lot of these incentives, you're going to have a much broader network. You're going to have better applicability when it comes to third-party providers coming in and being able to fund some of these charging stations that we know are going to be privately owned and publicly available. And I think that that's going to be a big part of how we're going to see the EV adoption kind of need to move in the future.
Thank you, Andrew. Jen, Allison, or Katie, anything you'd like to add to that? What is one policy change that you see could really change things for us?
Jennifer, I think you're on mute.
You're on mute,
Jennifer,
Jen.
go.
Yep.
Thanks. Remember, 46-year-old here. What I was going to say is two things. You know, I think the work of the Air Resources Board is so important in terms of the different policies and things that they're setting. I think that's critical because it sends market signals. But I think as well, when we're talking about, and this is not my area, but I'm going to get into it a little bit, the building design and the adaptive reuse that we do, making sure that when we're doing our buildings, we're actually making sure that they're ready for these 21st century technologies. That's one of the major concerns that we have, is that at the time when it's the least expensive to install a lot of these things, there isn't really the incentive or the thought process of actually putting it in. So I would say some of those policy perspectives are really important, but I think also making sure that we're really focusing on some of our socioeconomic disadvantaged communities. It's, you know, in my opinion, there's something not right about the fact that, you know, I live in Brea in Orange County, and if you go to my Whole Foods, there are chargers and they charge for free, and they're at the grocery stores. But there are other communities where their local grocery stores don't even have a charger, let alone have free charging. So it's one of those things where you have this thought process of the people who are advantaged can continue to be advantaged, and the people who need it more because of their air quality don't have that same opportunity.
Thank you, Jen. And I think you hit on an important point, and part of why we wanted to have this discussion. You know, a big part of our member base is architects, engineers, and others who are working on designing those projects or designing retrofit projects. And, you know, I think there's a need to look holistically from the top down on how do we anticipate where EV is going to be, you know, 5, 10, 15 years from now when we're working on these projects, if not longer. And I don't think that's happening right now on the scale we need to see. Katie, did you want to add something?
Sure. I mean, I think one change that I've been looking at, particularly like in European countries like Norway, is where they're you know, adding taxes onto fuel costs, onto gasoline and diesel and internal combustion vehicles. And it's not something that's necessarily all that palatable in California or in the US in general, but it's a very effective strategy. So at some point I would, you know, love for the US to explore that type of thing.
Allison, anything you want to add on this point before we move to the next question?
Sure. Katie, I'm glad you brought that up. That's almost like the elephant in the room, where there's like this conventional wisdom, like we can't touch the gas tax, but I kind of agree with you. I think it would speed things along to some extent. But aside from that, I think Andrew touched upon this a little bit, but there's a need for a lot more certainty. Especially in the heavy duty side, with manufacturers even having the incentive to start the development of prototypes and do the laborious work to test them and deploy them. It's quite expensive, and without kind of knowing that there's going to be a market for that, they would be less motivated. So all of the goal setting and target setting that Katie mentioned in her framing presentation, I think is really important. For example, Ports of LA and Long Beach have a goal that all of their drayage trucking will be electric by 2035. There's also regulatory push to kind of send that signal that, yes, this technology is going to be required. We need to develop it. We need to put in that effort because there will be a demand for it. So, you know, AQMD has regulations that they're developing for the ISR and warehouses. CARB has advanced clean trucks regulation coming up, and all of these set targets that by a certain point, a certain % of sales will be zero emission. And I think that kind of clear, consistent signal is, I think to your question, one of the biggest policy things that we can work on.
Thank you, Allison. And I want to say thank you to some of the folks who are putting questions into the chat. Please continue to put your questions in there, and we'll get to them in the Q&A session after we get to the subpanel. So please keep putting your questions in there. Next question I want to ask, I'm going to start with you, Andrew, again, since you sort of look at both sides of the equation. But where do you wish the public and private sectors were collaborating more right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think coming from a private engineering company, I'm really excited to collaborate with the public sector as much as it comes in terms of coming up with strategies on how to accelerate EV adoption. I think coming to the private sector and leveraging some of the expertise that we have in some of those sectors really helps us have a broader view. So, a great example is the work that I did over in partnership with the city of Roseville, who manages their own utility. We got to actually support them in developing a strategy that really tries to predict not just how much EV adoption they're going to have, but where is it going to happen within their city. So we looked at things like GIS data according to zoning and ownership of public and private land, but then also census data in terms of things like access to solar, single family homes, educational level, and really started to come up with a heat map for the city in terms of where electrification would happen within their city and how it would impact their transformers, how it would impact their infrastructure. And I think even more importantly, areas where it's not actually being that heavily impacted in terms of EV adoption. That allowed the city to come up with a game plan on capital improvements, how to go for outreach in areas where there wasn't a lot of EV adoption, and really where to put a lot of their efforts to really innovate and be a little bit smarter about how they want to accelerate the EV adoption plan. And what came out of that was really an overall strategy for the city of Roseville on how to accelerate EV adoption beyond the 2030 goal, and really look at it and say that we want to get more than just our share of the 5 million vehicles in California to electrify 2030. We want to have more than that. So, in my opinion, working with the public sector to come up with innovative solutions like that, working with charging networks to understand what they're doing in those types of landscapes as well, is a really powerful place where the public and private sector can come together.
Thank you, Andrew. No, that's a really good point. And Jen, I think in the position you sit, where you're really representing labor, where do you think the public and private sector could be collaborating more?
Well, I think it's an interesting perspective, right? Because we're trying to compare the public and the private, and remember the private sector is dominated by businesses, and businesses run with a different concept, which is if they're for profit, they're typically looking out for their shareholders, which by the way, that's what they're supposed to do. But in the public, there is the sense of the public good and public policy. So I think when we're thinking about both of those, I think framing it in terms of a different lever for the private, because in the conversations that we've had at NECA with different entities like goods movement, they'll talk to you about, in the heavy duty sector at least, their duty cycle. They'll talk about how much it costs for their trucks to not make certain destinations that they're supposed to make. And so part of it is when we use the typical framing for private of, does this fit into your business model in terms of EV? Some people say yes, and many people say no. So I think part of this discussion between public and private is getting the private to view it as something other than another aspect of their business model. Because I think when it comes down to dollars and cents, it requires a long-term investment, and many businesses are not kind of geared that way of, what does this look like for me 5, 10 years out? But that's one of the ways that we really need to be thinking about things and why that goal setting is so important. But you asked me about the labor perspective on that, and I wanted to touch on that. And I think that's part of what is so important in this, because for what we do, we have the contractors as well as the electricians. So the contractors, for those of you who may or may not know, bid all of these projects out, and the workers are working on them. And why this is so important is because one of the main stumbling blocks for a lot of this, a lot of times, are people who are concerned about, what does this mean for me in terms of my job? What does this mean for me in terms of if I'm in an industry that's dependent on typical fossil fuels? And for some people that can be very concerning. So part of the question also is creating those incentives and putting those frameworks in place so that we are creating those good jobs for people in these clean energy technologies.
Thank you, Jen. Allison, as someone who really represents a lot of the public sector, what would you say we could use more collaboration on?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have kind of a two-part answer to that. First, I wanted to point out all the ways where we are collaborating, because we are actually kind of constantly pulling together multi-sectoral partnerships to address this very issue. A great example is all the demonstration projects going on. The ports are for sure a key stakeholder, and they have a TAP program where they are investing in advancing technologies. AQMD also has a budget, and quite a couple of years ago, maybe about 5 years ago, SCAG and some of these other partners formed what we call the Zero Emission Trucks Collaborative. And we kind of decided as a region, there is so much, there's so many grant opportunities and we all have these projects, but we need to work together to bring that funding to Southern California to fund these projects here. As you can imagine, they're incredibly expensive. And it doesn't help if we're all submitting grant applications in competition with each other. So that's a great example, I guess, of public-public collaboration where all these agencies are working together to prioritize and tackle the problem. These demonstration projects also involve partners in the private side where they have an incentive to test out the technology, give direct feedback. The OEMs are also participating with in-kind services or by contributing to their prototype. So I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't point out all the great examples of collaboration already underway. And through kind of my experience, the thing that I find to be one of the biggest obstacles to collaboration is data sharing and setting up kind of trust and I guess standards of sharing what businesses would consider proprietary information that they would use to increase their competitive advantage. And that's oftentimes the type of data that, you know, people like me as a planner could really benefit from. You know, if a company has a trip reduction strategy or a way to do different kind of routing or dispatching, I mean, that would be great for us to know. Then we would have more information about where the priority stops are going to be, what the origins and destinations are in the priority locations. And in a way that kind of gets to what Jennifer was saying about the need to consider the business model. I mean, as a public sector representative, we definitely want to be considerate of the business's model. And those are in fact a lot of the obstacles that have been identified. The long time for charging, where are they going to stop and for how long? But, you know, if there was more of a trust and kind of like a way to have a little bit of a black box around some of that data so that the planners and policymakers could be privy to it without having it be completely open, I think that would be one way to improve communications and solve that collaborative challenge.
Thank you, Allison. That's a really tactical suggestion, so I appreciate that. We need real solutions like that. Katie, you want to bring us home before we move to the next subpanel here?
Sure. So I would love to see a lot more collaboration between the mobility companies and cities in particular. So, you know, like Uber has, you know, had a pretty contentious relationship with even the city of LA and other cities that, how Allison was talking about, you know, data sharing is something that would be is really important, and trust between cities and mobility companies is something that's really important. But traditionally, a lot of those companies have not done all that well around that. Some companies have. You know, I think Lyft's announcement with about EV charging this week is really interesting and can help change that relationship. But same thing for like scooter companies and some of the other new types of mobility companies. And I think I would love to see a lot more concerted effort by those companies to be more collaborative with public sector and cities.
Thank you. That's a great point, and they have a huge role to play, especially if these types of commitments now can really help define, going back to that long-term planning, where people invest for the future. With that, we're going to move to our grid subpanel. Again, we're going to come back to all of our speakers for some questions at the end. Same deal here, a couple minutes just to really quickly introduce yourself and explain your role in the value chain when it comes to EV infrastructure. Justin, you're up first.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here today to talk to you about EV infrastructure, something we're passionate about at SoCal Edison. As many of you know, SoCal Edison is a large publicly owned utility in Southern California, covering most of the area outside of the city of LA. I'm a senior project manager there, specifically leading a program we have known as Charge Ready Transport that provides free infrastructure for fleets looking to electrify up to the step out of a charging station. We also have several other infrastructure programs focused on light duty vehicles, multi-unit dwellings, etc., rebate charger programs, things like that. Really see our role in the marketplace of helping customers take that first step towards electrification and reducing some of those early cost barriers there. So look forward to discussing EV infrastructure impacts on the grid today. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Scott? So you're on mute, Scott. Going once.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Scott.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, again, Scott Briasco with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. I'm the program manager for electric transportation here, and so we've been pretty actively involved in electric transportation activities, you know, going back to the 1990s. And, you know, I personally have been involved almost my entire career, so it's over 30 years on electric transportation, so it's pretty exciting. You know, we've come a long way. So, you know, at LADWP, we're the municipal utility that serves the citizens of Los Angeles. It's over 4 million. And we have a number of programs in play, you know, rebate programs for residential customers with charging, you know, charger rebates, rebates for commercial applications, the used electric vehicle rebates. Some of the rebates also cover DC fast charging, medium and heavy duty charger rebates, and really kind of partnering with you know, industry and city agencies to facilitate electric transportation activities to try to grow electric vehicles and electric vehicle usage in the city of Los Angeles. And I'll end it there.
Thank you, Scott. David?
Hey everyone, David Navarez from ChargePoint. A little bit of background. ChargePoint is working to create the new fueling network. We're working to move all people and goods on electricity. We're doing it one parking lot, one depot at a time. ChargePoint provides flexible solutions, which includes integrated hardware and cloud services to support businesses, any and all applications that are looking to provide electric vehicle charging stations to their property portfolio, and of course, fleet depots. I've been lucky enough to be down here in the LA market for a number of years now, so we've been working on adding EV charging. Up until this point, we've been grateful to work with a lot of important portfolios, and they've been very supportive as we deploy thousands of charging stations across the city and county of Los Angeles. And I'll stop there and I'll let Ben go now, so I appreciate the time.
Thanks, David. Ben, the sub-panelist with the best name on the sub-panel, go ahead. I think you're on mute. I don't think we can hear you still, Ben. It's like the mute button is like a hidden thing for everyone. It's there, you got it.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go. Yep.
Sorry about that. Yeah, my name is Ben, so Ben number 2. I've been working in the EV charging industry for almost 5 years. A lot has changed in that period, which is really exciting to witness. I've previously come from other industries that's been disrupted by innovation. So I actually launched Grubhub in Los Angeles, but that was 10 years ago before you guys probably used it. And became a mainstream thing. And then I worked in genetics, which has had a lot of advancements in the field, and it was a very huge adjustment for the medical space. So out of all of them, the EV industry has by far the biggest impact on everyday life. and there's a lot of players involved in assisting the change. So it's exciting to be in. I work for Rexel Energy Solutions, so we're a distributor that helps ESCOs and contractors with their EV projects. But more so, we help educate them and empower them to become experts themselves, so they can consult customers and go from there.
Thank you, Ben. So my first question here, and this is actually kind of feeding off of our last panel, is a question we had that I thought really sparked some interesting ideas for me, in that how likely is it for utilities or other third parties to operate charging infrastructure to reduce the capital costs for owners? We just talked about some of the challenges in the previous sub-panel with private companies funding infrastructure, and here we've got some great folks to talk about the grid. So are there models that you're looking at that can help fund some of that infrastructure divide to get us there faster? I don't know if Justin or Scott, if you want to jump on that first.
Yeah, I can jump in there. I'd say we aren't necessarily looking to operate charging infrastructure, mostly looking at where does our expertise lie, right? And that's in the deployment of infrastructure, right? And building out grid and supporting equipment to power that charging equipment. And we feel there's a great marketplace of charging equipment manufacturers and network providers that are better equipped to support customers in that role. And so we continue just to focus on, all of our programs focus on the infrastructure side. That being said, we do have a couple smaller programs where we've identified marketplaces that could use a little bit more utility involvement. Potentially we have a program for state parks and beaches where we're looking to potentially own and operate through a third-party partner and things like that. But our focus continues to be on building the infrastructure to support that charging equipment.
Scott, anything you would add to that from a utility perspective?
Sure, yeah, I would say that, so it's a combination of the two. For the city of Los Angeles, we have built out some infrastructure and own and operate that, including, chargers on street lights. So we have several hundred there, and then Department of Water and Power facilities where we've installed DC fast charge plazas and level 2 chargers, and that could be at service centers and other locations, even under our downtown headquarters building here, where we make access to those chargers and use of those free to the public. So it's a pretty good deal. But primarily it is supporting third parties to come in and install that infrastructure at private businesses, and a lot of that is facilitated through our rebate program. So for level 2, it's a $5,000 per charger rebate for a level 2 charger, and I think a lot of folks have found ways to really make that work for them, and it's turning into thousands of chargers here, even over the last year. So it's really been successful. And then for DC fast charging, our program is $75,000 per DC fast charger installed, and for medium and heavy duty, it's up to $125,000. So it's really providing the incentives out there for those third parties to really come in and utilize that money and really make that work for the installation and operation by those third parties.
So David and Ben, as the third parties in some ways, how would you sort of respond to that in terms of how you collaborate, what kind of models should be in place for that infrastructure?
David, did you want to go, or do you want me to?
I go ahead and start, and then I'll jump in after.
So I would say it's for third parties to operate, it's already happening. So manufacturers offer a own and operate model. Some utilities have done it in the past, and then there's third-party operators. I think the question is about reducing the capital costs for owners. I think Justin and Scott have launched really great programs in the past, and they have upcoming ones that has done that. I think the operation is more the customers themselves, how much it's appealing to have a fueling solution and manage it from a day-to-day responsibility. Do they want to do that, or do they want someone else to manage that and control it for them? So it's more of a preference thing. I think to bring in the private sector to own and operate a fueling solution on someone's workplace property or so forth is not entirely necessary when you've got great programs. I think retail is a good example where that kind of does work. They want stations because it creates foot traffic, and there's a great ROI for that anyway, because they're making money out of that foot traffic. But they don't want to be a fueling operator. They just want to be a retailer. So it depends on the vertical. I think the private sector will probably drive that. But again, that capital reduction has already been sort of fueled from good programs.
David, anything to add to that before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I'd actually really just add to that point. There are certain situations where we are still living in the chicken and the egg argument, what comes first, infrastructure or vehicles. And there have been great utility partners that have jumped ahead. Certain situations like Kansas City Power and Light, obviously in the middle of America, where maybe EV adoption is slower and utility ownership really expands EV infrastructure significantly faster than just EV adoption from a consumer level, or even just our neighbors south of us, SDG&E with their Power Your Drive program that also launched to help support the scalability of EV charging. The only difference here, the only thing I would add to Ben's point is Scott and Justin, both of LADWP and SE, have great utility programs that are actually doing a similar situation in terms of scaling EV. But to the last panel, this actually creates a pretty good question or a comment. In this area, maybe it seems like utility owned and operating in disadvantaged communities could be a good way to scale those areas where maybe finding funding for those projects, especially when they have to build out the electrical infrastructure just to power the station, may be something that's limiting those areas or communities from really adopting electric vehicles. And maybe in those situations, we could see some partnerships there where the utility comes in, maybe provides customer choice, 1, 2, 3 networks, and then of course takes on the ownership from that for that relationship moving forward.
That's a great point, David. And your audio is cutting in and out a little bit, but essentially he's talking about utilities coming in and really implementing that infrastructure in disadvantaged communities and owning that and operating that. I think it's a really interesting concept to continue to explore. My last question for this sub-panel is I guess it's another elephant in the room, but how do we actually provide adequate power throughout the grid to make charging available for everyone? And is that even possible right now? Maybe I'll start again with Justin, but how do you think we can get there?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say right now what we're seeing in the marketplace is that the grid is not a restriction, right? Customers are just, especially fleet customers, right, are just starting to dip their toe in the water. Electrification, 10 buses, 15, 20 buses, right? It's not enough load to really make an impact on the grid, thanks to a lot of the great energy efficiency projects that your organization has helped with over the last decade or two. There is room on most of our circuits. That being said, similar to what Andrew mentioned earlier, we're doing a comprehensive study of our service area, identifying where is fleet electrification most likely to happen. We're out there talking to customers about their long-term fleet electrification plans so that we know that, hey, we know you're only getting 10 buses now, but if you plan to have 100 or 150 in the next 5 years, we need to work together to make sure that the grid can support that. And then beyond just the studies, we're partnering with customers to think about innovative solutions on load side management, right? The continued integration of distributed energy resources. There's great innovation happening on the charging equipment front with integrated battery storage inside chargers, integration of solar. All of those things, I think, paired together are going to help the grid effectively support EV infrastructure, but completely agree it's something we have to keep a top priority and continue to work towards diligently.
I think that was a really good and comprehensive answer. So I might move to another question here that I wanted to hit before we got out of this panel, which was, how should property owners and designers and developers do a better job of working with utilities and looking at EV charging in their projects? And I'll start with Ben. Any thoughts on that? Like, how can they be doing better up front on that side before we get into our building panel?
So I guess from from existing buildings is just talk to your utilities. They have great programs. Build those retrofits with the future in mind, not just be reactive. And also, when you're looking at adding load, look at energy reduction as well. So Justin mentioned, some of the programs. There's lighting, there's HVAC, there's motors and drives. So there's a lot that you can actually do to reduce load as well at existing buildings. And then when it comes to new builds, when we're talking designers and developers, they're in a great position where they've got a blank canvas. Again, don't be reactive. California State has as a mandate to be 5% of parking spots EV ready. I would say build in more. And that gives the utilities a chance to build in more capacity for the future, saves them having to do service drops later on, which is extremely time consuming, and they could be using time on other things. It also allows them to build future demand and capacity forecasting for these new builds. So I think the current policy in place is great. It's kind of forcing developers to think about it. I just think it can you can go a lot further, and it would help the utility on the new builds.
Thank you, Ben. David, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, it's actually a little bit of policy as well, since we're talking about getting ahead of the game. All I would say is continuing the conversation with upgrading building codes, not just on a state level, but on a local level, working with developers to understand how you can at least make ready the infrastructure so that in the future, all of that utility demand is already planned for. A lot of the issues are around existing buildings where it's limited demand, or say not limited demand, but limited load. And of course, we got to be conscious of the building owner as well. Their job, they make a lot of money through their tenants. They don't make a whole lot of money through EV charging. And we don't want to take away all their power just to put in EV charging. We need to understand that what's important to them is also providing their tenants with adequate power to run their necessary building, or I should say necessary businesses. So just getting ahead of the game, consistently updating building codes, getting in front of design. That's how we're really going to scale this thing, and just trying to have open communication with existing building owners where, you have limited infrastructure, and working with your local utility like SCE and LADWP to understand how do I not only start a service drop, but what does that process look like, and maybe how can we simplify that process or expedite that process so I can get to charging my tenants faster.
Thank you, David. Scott, anything to add to close the sub-panel out before we move to the next one?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the focus from my end would be the part of collaborating with utilities, and I think the message would be, come and talk to us early on in the process, and it does take time for the larger installations if they're utility side upgrades. So especially as we're kind of getting into the fleet electrification and some of the requirements on those fleets, if they're going to be large upgrades, we certainly don't want to be slowing down that process. And if they're buying vehicles and they're coming in and they have an expectation that maybe the infrastructure could be in 6 months, and if it's a big upgrade, then obviously it takes a lot longer. So, getting in early to talk to us so that we can help kind of plan and work through those some of those hurdles. That's helpful. And then from the city of Los Angeles, the Green Building Code ordinance is actually a lot more aggressive than the state. So it's 30% parking spaces EV ready with 10% charging installed. So it's a lot cheaper and more efficient to do it during the construction process for new construction than versus coming back and retrofitting that in. So that is just, I think, helpful in the planning process.
Thanks, Scott, and go City of LA. That's great. That is aggressive. It's great to see that. All right, so we started at policy, we went to grid, and now we're getting down to the building level. Our next sub-panel, same deal. Try to keep it quick and just talk about your role in the value chain when it comes to charging infrastructure. Ryan, you're up first.
Sure. Hi, guys. Ryan DeFlavio here, PCS Energy. We're a renewable energy company doing commercial solar and EV charging, mainly focused in the LA area, so our footprint's pretty tight. We basically act as a turnkey service provider to help people to deploy EVSE in commercial, multifamily, pretty much all home markets, and help them to utilize rebates that are available that we've been discussing, and really do everything from engineering to deployment to collecting rebates, activations, the whole process. So that's about it.
Ariel?
Hi, folks. My name is Ariel Fan. I'm the founder CEO of Green Wealth Energy. Like PCS, Green Wealth is also a turnkey developer of EV charging projects in specializing in LA County. What we do a little bit differently from other EV companies is that we use our voice for a champion of equity and inclusion. We believe that EV charging is truly the big event in our lifetimes, just like in smartphones. This is a runway of over the next 10 to 20 years. And we have the chance to build an equity in this. With EV charging, it's not just an electrical project, but we can include 10 of the 17 sustainable development goals with UN. All of our engineers are small businesses, minority-owned businesses within the LA local area. And we're proud to be the first woman and minority-owned energy company in the state of California.
Thank you, Ariel, and we're proud to have you on our board, so thanks for representing. Next, we have Chris. It possibly might be the best beard we've ever had in our quarterly thought leadership series, so thank you, Chris.
Thanks. I'm Chris Luffman. As a director in sustainability at Greystar, I oversaw the development of our EV strategy at Greystar, which included both infrastructure and car sharing strategies, and EV car sharing strategy. And really, multifamily in particular plays a really critical role, I think, when it comes to the rollout of EV, because despite the pause in EV that Katie mentioned earlier, when price parity occurs, and it will, 35 to 45% of the population lives in rental property. And when you understand the mindset of the EV driver, 80% to 90% of all charging occurs at home. So multifamily suddenly is in the spotlight there because a large number of residents buying EV vehicles, if I don't have infrastructure in place, I'm now at a potential disadvantage when it comes to the retention of tenants or the attraction of new tenants. So it's certainly something on the radar for both Greystar and many multifamily real estate companies across the area. In fact, we'll get into it in a little bit on Class A versus Class B, but LA in particular, if you don't have infrastructure in place in a multifamily setting, you're at a competitive disadvantage now.
Thank you, Chris. Jasmine, last but most certainly not least.
I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine. I'm a sustainability manager at Kilroy Realty, and we like to have EV charging at our properties. So that's where we come in here in this discussion.
Thank you, Jasmine. So my first question, I'm going to start with the folks on the ownership side. What are your biggest pain points right now when it comes to looking at and putting in EV infrastructure? Maybe I'll start with Jasmine, and then we'll go back to Chris.
I think our biggest pain point or just concern is capacity, and I know they were talking about that a little bit on our last sub panel, and it's not a huge concern right now, but definitely capacity concerns, but also just being able to, for existing buildings, tie into that existing infrastructure, more transformers, that sort of stuff.
Thank you. Chris, anything you would add to that in terms of pain points on your end?
Honestly, I would echo that really loudly because infrastructure is the biggest challenge with existing buildings. I think Scott hit on this a little bit earlier, but if you can plan ahead and run even if you don't install chargers, if you just put the infrastructure in place to install chargers later, there's a cost reduction factor of 3 to 5 times just by having the planning and forethought. So if we can get more architects and planners, and I know we've already talked about LA's code requirements, but you know, we used to say in low voltage cabling, just run the conduit now. Just go ahead and run it. It's the same way in EV. While the ground is open, it's much cheaper to get the infrastructure in place, even if you don't put a charger in place. So that is the single biggest issue, because if I don't have infrastructure in place with the existing buildings, and most buildings are already there, it's a much bigger challenge to get the electricity from the panel to where you want to put the charger, and it costs a lot more. So that becomes a challenge.
Now, are you seeing issues around panel upgrades as well? Is just overall building capacity, going to be a hurdle, and how soon?
No, it depends on the age of the building, for sure. I mean, there are opportunities, especially, creative opportunities. We see, during retrofits, people eliminate laundry rooms and put in-unit laundry machines, washers and dryers, and suddenly you may gain capacity or panel access through those type of renovations. I think the key is that you just have to plan ahead. And so when you're doing a renovation, you have to be thinking about, what can I do with this electricity? But yeah, I mean, absolutely. If I'm locked into my existing panels and I'm already maxed out on everything, it's going to cost a lot more to put in a charging station than had I had the foresight to plan ahead.
Jasmine, on your end, are you hitting those same sort of capacity issues? You've been able to find creative solutions to create capacity in the commercial space?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with what Chris is saying, and we're always working on coming up with more solutions every year, just planning ahead with our property teams and whatnot, how we can get more charging in. But yeah, I think the main thing is just not having some of these existing buildings not having had the foresight to put in that infrastructure, and it can be really challenging even deciding like where to pull power from.
Thank you. And Ryan, I'm going to go back to you for a moment, but how do developers and building owners maximize their incentives and maximize in that design process their investment when it comes to looking at putting in infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say a big part of that ties into load management, on the software side of it. So understanding how, the software can help you to balance these loads, whether it's dynamically across the board with all the other existing equipment that's coming off of your house main panel. We've done, over 7,000 chargers installed in the city of LA. I'd say good 75% of that has been in buildings that were not built in the last 20 years. So it takes a lot of creative engineering, creative installations, working with the building owner on kind of what their expectations are. Because with load management, you do get a slower charge, but in a multifamily setting where people are parked for longer periods of time and, want to just wake up in the morning with a full battery, it's the expectations can be met. So it's setting expectations, engineering things properly and understanding, what you're capable of doing.
Thank you, Ryan. Ariel, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so the question is, what can building owners do to increase their footprint, right?
No, just to really maximize their incentives or reduce their overall cost to add infrastructure to the buildings.
Yeah, I think what Ryan covered is exactly right. The load balancing. ChargePoint on the call, they really have the pioneering software with the load balancing technology. We're seeing a huge surgence of new chargers coming online that adapt that sort of load balancing, which is you can have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 chargers where previously without it you could only put in one. Regarding just considering footprint, since we do a lot of work with multifamilies, I find that a lot of times when a building is getting rebates, let's say they wanted to do 20 incentives, that's because they had 20 residents living in that community. And once they put out a resident survey out there, I'm just speaking of a project we're working with now, they have 100 different units in their condo complex. And they found that 82% of all their residents wanted charging. So just in terms of considering how do they increase and plan for the right amount, number one, just look for the maximization of the rebate, but also like consider how realistically, how many EV chargers do you need and future plan, take advantage of the incentives out now rather than wait for them to deplete.
Thank you. And you know, I was going to ask the question if we thought that EV charging was ready to go from amenities and necessity, but it sounds like we've answered that already, at least in the LA area. The last question I have for this group is, how do you see building design changing to accommodate EVs or infrastructure in the office, retail, or multifamily sectors? Are you seeing things changing? Chris, I saw you had your hand raised. Did you want to answer that?
I was going to pile on to Ryan and Ariel just for 1 second, because I think if you take one step even further back, knowledge of the market, so therefore partnering with a ChargePoint or a company like that can tell you what the market saturation is, what the pricing is for charging, and what the consumption potential may be, so how many people are buying EVs, is critical. And having a plan in place for how to deploy that before you deploy it is critical, because these incentives go fast, especially in California. I mean, sometimes in days. So if you're thinking that you're going to be contacted by somebody that says, hey, let's do an incentive to help me offset my costs, there's a pretty good chance that that incentive is already gone by the time you heard about it. So I was just going to pile on to their earlier comment that pre-planning and having almost a workflow in place for when the incentive gets announced is super important.
Thank you, Chris. And Jasmine, maybe we'll close out with you before we open to some Q&A. You know, are you seeing design changing? I know Kilroy's got the new Netflix campus that they're putting online. I mean, how are you seeing design changing on your end?
Just on my end, I'm pretty new at Kilroy, but mostly, yeah, just getting, it was mentioned earlier, just get ahead of design with all of this. And so when we're planning and coordinating and collaborating in our charrettes, I think that's where a lot of that happens. But yeah, unfortunately, I haven't had the privilege to go to all of our properties because I've been in quarantine, and check out how these design changes have been implemented at Kilroy, but I know they're happening.
Thank you. Ryan or Ariel, anything to add to that on the design side before we move to Q&A?
One thing I would emphasize, similar to like what Chris was talking about with conduit and kind of having some basic infrastructure designs, you know, being emphasized, because a lot of people try to maybe over-engineer it, who maybe, you know, in some cases, especially on the smaller, more independent level, aren't quite experienced in how that relates to deployment. And so they tend to set up infrastructure that is not as useful on the end.
Yeah, I guess some closing comments. Then I want to just address quickly the first question you had asked Chris and Jasmine, which is, you know, how can, what's accelerating deployment, and also what are potentially the roadblocks in slowing down the deployment. So one thing that I've seen happen with regards to rebate, to take advantage of all the utility planners and utility folks on the phone, is we've seen a lot of interpretation of code, and the confusion around that really slow down rebates. And that is something that I think both property owners, but specifically developers should be aware of. We're finding that because EV is so new, a lot of specific engineers and different utility programs, they have their own interpretation, and that actually slows down the engineering. So regarding, you know, how to make deployments go faster, how to secure your rebate dollars sooner, I'd ask for the support of utility to work with their team for continuity around code interpretation.
That's an excellent tactical point as well. I appreciate those tactical points. I'm going to go to some of the questions here in the chat. And by the way, Ariel, thank you for answering some of these in very good detail. But this is an important question, I think, especially for LA. And this comes from Ruben. How do we crack the multifamily challenge of getting charging infrastructure into apartments and condos? It sounds like Chris is really kind of addressing that, but you know, I would guess that, you know, far above 40% of our residents here are probably multifamily buildings here in LA. So how do we crack that? You know, this is open to anyone of our speakers today.
Sure. This is Scott. I'll take a stab at that. Yeah, actually, the number is 50% here in the city of LA, and I think, you know, we've been really surprised through our rebate program that a very large percentage of the charger rebates are going to multifamily installations, and I think PCS and ChargePoint can jump in to kind of confirm that, but it's happening. Of course, through the new building, the green building code ordinances for new construction will obviously continue to support that effort, but it is important. So we're seeing that it's happening.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. I'll chime in behind Scott on that in the sense that from a utility perspective, the importance of programs like what Scott's organization has, because quite honestly, this is cost. There's no revenue typically that's going to be generated for an owner in a multifamily off of the installation of EV, and we're not looking to make money off of it. But we are looking not to go negative with it. So if we can at least make it a cost-neutral proposition, and programs like what you have in LA help with that tremendously. If I were to do that same installation in where I'm at, which is in the middle of the country in St. Louis, it's very difficult to make the numbers work here unless it's a new development and everything is just perfect. But if I need to go into an existing building and I may be paying 5 times the cost, why would I do that as a building owner when I'm going to get zero revenue out of that? At this point, at least in St. Louis, I would call it an amenity. I would say in LA, it's probably a necessity. But I think those utility programs play such a critical role in helping at least balance it to provide that incentive for the owner.
Ryan, did you want to add something?
No, I mean, that's a really good point. I think there's kind of 2 sides to it. There's the installation, which the rebates are very helpful to kind of allow that infrastructure to be built, the chargers to be bought. Then there's ongoing costs. You have software costs, you have maintenance costs. So all those things tie into the type of setting you're in, your location of chargers, what purpose they're serving, and kind of how you're trying to generate revenue, whether it's in a retail space where it is driving foot traffic, or in the multifamily sector, you don't have as many variables when it comes to the infrastructure and the location of chargers. It's a little bit more straightforward compared to commercial or office buildings.
Ben, you're muted if you're trying to say something. Just to.
My God, I'm sorry. I want to jump in there and add the whole cracking the multifamily challenge. I mean, it's kind of been done in LA, and it's companies like PCS Energy that's actually done it. So I know we showed a slide on Shell and saying we need these big companies to come in and help us. Not really. Like there's companies like PCS that put 7,000 charging stations in with the multifamily. We have a solar company in Oklahoma that put 300 DC chargers in. So there's the contractors and the energy companies out there that can do it. It's these rebate programs that are stimulating the market. And Chris is right, you know, looking and being informed of these rebates are important. Those that don't jump on it and are followers or laggers, they're eventually going to have to find the budget to pay out of pocket because their competitors and so forth in the private sector has already got it. And Ben, you said, when does it become a necessity? It's pretty much in there from city to city at different stages, but it will. So, you know, kudos to the contractors, kudos to LADWP for putting those programs, because that's where you're going to get it.
Thank you, Ben. And typically to close us out, we like to go through some commitments that different parts of the value chain can make to kind of move forward on the issue. And then we'll have some time for Q&A and just networking at the end here once we close. One of the things that I've heard today really is a commitment on the developer side and the building owner manager side is just to involve your partners early, involve your utilities, involve your contractors. And it sounds like there probably needs to be some education up front for the folks who are doing design on really providing, you know, additional conduit, you know, over engineering, or I guess over providing extra infrastructure up front. You know, is there a way that we could promote more education around that? It sounds like that's something that's kind of a roadblock right now. People just aren't thinking up front about how much they need to change their design to accommodate EVs in the future. You know, what do you think is something that us at USGBCLA could really put out there to ask building owners, developers, and managers to do, you know, earlier? I'll just open this up to everyone. Anyone want to add to that?
I feel like you almost answered the question right before the question with the whole involvement. I can tell you that a lot of what we do is education and design. We're not in there just to, you know, sell EV charging stations and walk away. This is still a brand new industry, although it's an exciting brand new industry and it's evolving and evolving quickly. But there is still a lot of education. And quite frankly, it is difficult to think ahead in some situations, especially when it comes to EV charging. How do I plan for today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And that's where folks, everybody, I guess, on this call has data, has information where we can at least come back and provide some of that education, provide some of that knowledge with data behind it to support, you know, whatever application, multifamily, commercial, retail, to see if it in fact aligns with their business goals and making, you know, business sense to add EV charging.
Is there more we could see from tenants? You know, this is a question I'd pose to everyone also. You know, do tenants have a bigger role to play here in part of the value chain?
I mean, the tenant drives why an owner is going to respond, right? So if I am trying to provide a product and the tenant and I'm not addressing what the tenant's needs are, they're going to go elsewhere. So for sure, being aware of the needs, which is kind of where that partnership comes in with somebody who can explain or kind of read the tea leaves for us to help us understand what the market saturation is. Because I'm not plugged into the manufacturers as a building owner to understand how many EVs are being purchased, right? But there are people like ChargePoint who are plugged into those manufacturers and who are finding out how many are being bought in a particular market. And then I, as an owner, can start to forecast and match that saturation to my need, you know, to what I need to plan for, you know, and kind of earlier to that point with LEED in particular on USGBC, you know, the inclusion of EV charging as a LEED checklist item, if you will. I think that's a big move. I think that's an important move. Now moving it to mandatory instead of, you know, would be another move. But you know, I think that's starting to move in that direction, that getting people to think that way. Because quite honestly, I need the architects to be thinking about this. I need when this is at the very early planning stage is the most cost-effective time to be planning for this. I mean, I said earlier, run the conduit. If in doubt, run it.
Jasmine, do you have something you want to add?
I changed my mind. Chris covered a lot of it, but coming from a construction background and being on site on projects, just as far as sustainability in general in building, I was like, why aren't we building to these standards? And it goes back to the owners and just, again, education that you prefaced earlier. And EV charging is a thing. Sustainability is a thing. Architects, let's, get this into our design and just sharing information in these various market sectors so we can hone in our sustainability initiatives and practices and stuff.
Ben, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi. I was going to say, in terms of the question about the multifamily sector, so in San Diego, the Verdani team, we worked with SCG&E on a program called Power Your Drives, and it was targeting putting 3,500 charging stations on buildings, and I think 30 to 40% of that was targeting multifamily, and that's actually our project was focused on getting the stations to the multifamily sector. And it was really challenging, especially like the multifamily properties in downtown, for example. Some didn't have enough parking spaces for it. So like it was a very targeted type of building profile that would kind of that would be like a good candidate for it. But we've developed a lot of tools and resources that were very specific to multifamily sector. And I'll be happy to share some of those. But it was a really interesting program. And it was the biggest struggle getting, they were 100% free to multifamily owners. So eventually the program got fully subscribed. But it was an effort even to find the properties, even saying like, hey, this is 100% free, and the power, like they would have like a 10-year easement on the property. They would pay for the fee 100%, and the power just goes directly to the utility, so it kind of bypassed the building systems. But it was a really interesting program. So I think it's also important to like learn lessons learned from other cities that have done it, like other utilities that have done these types of programs, so that we're also not trying to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you, Danielle. And it sounds like we covered a lot of the commitments for architects and engineers in terms of that early commitment. We had an interesting comment here in the chat, which is that developers should be offering EV charging as a unit specification option that they could pay for on their mortgage. That way developers will be incentivized to offer EV charging as it improves the marketability and generates additional sales revenue and I guess value for those units. That's an interesting comment, and I don't know if has anyone seen that currently on any properties that they've seen where that's an option, like an add-on option for a condo or for an apartment?
Then I want to say that the place where I live, it's kind of a multifamily space, and luckily they did have the EV charging stations, and it's free, and I have an electric vehicle, so I do think that's going to be a huge, potentially like draw a benefit or a thing you can market by saying you have that infrastructure on site as more people start switching. So like right now, basically they don't charge, so it's free. It's free right now for us to fill the car.
Awesome.
So it's great. Yeah.
I'd say it's a little limited on the application. I don't believe apartment complexes offer anything like that. That would be more so specific to deeded parking spaces with respect to like HOAs, where technically I believe that square footage is represented within the total square footage of the property. But even more so there, that gets a little challenging as well, because it really still depends on where you're pulling that power from. Is it coming off a house meter, or does that location happen to have maybe maybe a multi-meter system where every meter is actually applied back to the residential account with either SCE or LADWP. But in certain situations, there are definitely locations that are offering that ability to have a charging station installed. And it can potentially, I don't want to say guarantee, but it can potentially add value to the property and maybe the transaction of sale. Right?
Awesome, thank you. Now our last round of commitments here, it's around utilities and municipalities, and then we're going to go to our laser breakout and then close out the rest of the panel. One of the things I heard today that I thought was really just great ideas for utilities to be a lot more active and aggressive in installing and owning and operating infrastructure in disadvantaged communities. That's something I'd love to help advocate for over here at USGBC-LA. I think that's a great point. Are there other commitments that our panel can think about in terms of things that utilities and municipalities could be doing?
So I think one thing I can jump in here, Ben, just on the disadvantaged community comment, that is definitely something we've been looking into in ensuring equitable distribution of charging for electric vehicles. And so actually our big infrastructure program, Charge Ready Transport, is a requirement that 40% of the infrastructure be located in disadvantaged communities. So it's still not an own operate model, but at least we're focusing on finding ways to deploy infrastructure there. But in terms of looking ahead to future commitments, and we're constantly brainstorming on other ways that it makes sense for the utility to get involved. So we're looking into some things lately around customer education in terms of how do customers, like fleet customers, take advantage of things like LCFS credits? What is the right rate design, moving forward? We currently waive demand charges, but what does it look like in 5-6 years, things like that. And so just finding other ways to partner and provide customer education wherever we see a void in the market.
Thank you, Justin. Andrew, did you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one thing I was noticing and I read about, which I thought was a good program, San Diego did a pilot program that, kind of going to that disadvantaged community. They allowed for pre-approval of rebates for EV purchases. So that means that the rebates didn't come as a check in the mail later on. It came as a point of sale reduction of kind of the cost. And I think that's a really good way to incentivize and be able to provide for especially some of the lower income folks who don't have that CapEx to really be able to, handle taking on the cost of a vehicle without the rebate directly in their hand right away. I think that's really, really important, and we need to look at more programs and more ways to make incentives fair for lower income communities and for the pro equity that we want to have. If we look at this overall, I mean, African Americans are exposed to 43% more pollution than white Americans in California. Households with less than $20,000 of annual income are exposed to 10% more than the state average as a whole. So I think we really have to focus in on making sure our incentives provide as much equity as possible for a lot of those vulnerable communities.
Thank you, Andrew. And
I'd like.
It seems like that's. Oh, go ahead, David.
I would say I love that comment, Andrew, and I'd actually like to add to that. There are utilities across the United States. For example, two of them come to mind. AEP out in Ohio, I believe it's American Electric Power, and then Eversource out in Massachusetts, where they actually have increased their rebates to cover the infrastructure and the actual station itself, specific to disadvantaged communities. I believe AEP provides about an 80 or 90% rebate, and I believe Eversource is 100%. So offering that additional value to those areas where they truly need it versus developers in non-disadvantaged communities that are building these multi-million-dollar high-rise towers. I'm very much an advocate for that, and I'd love to see some utility adjustment on their rebates to provide that incentive to those disadvantaged communities.
That's awesome, and that seems like something municipalities could be helping with as well, especially as they're looking at setting percentages for parking, maybe even making those more aggressive in certain communities or in certain building types to help encourage adoption at a faster rate. I think that's something municipalities can maybe do as well. Well, we're a little over time now. Been a lot of great commentary today. I really appreciate everyone's time. We're going to have a portion of our panelists break out into our laser group, and then we'll have some additional time between now and 6 o'clock for Q&A. So for those of you in the laser, I think Becky's going to go ahead and break some of you out right now. And then I'm going to go ahead and close out our regularly scheduled program. And if there's any additional questions, we're here to hang out and answer those, or just chit chat a little bit. That's all part of it right now. One thing I wanted to mention is that we do have more of these thought leadership events coming later this year. We had an event on reentry, redesign, and resilience in June, really looking towards what's changing for all of us in real estate right now. That was really focused on the COVID response. I think with everything that's happened in the past few weeks and the importance that we've even highlighted today about equity as part of this conversation, we're going to do a whole session just focused as we look at reentry and long-term resilience and even redesign, how do we put equity at the core of that conversation? So I'm excited to do that in August. In September, we'll be talking about local water, and in November, we're going to be talking about decarbonization again, which is something we looked at last year in September. And then one of the things that we've done as an organization recently, we launched what we're calling the Healthy Building Alliance a few weeks ago. This is something we've been working on for about a year. It's not a certification, but a commitment that any building or tenant can make to provide healthy and resilient spaces to live, work, and play. It's a commitment to 5 principles around building health, including indoor air quality, green cleaning, access to nature, inspiring movement for your occupants, and annual water testing. We've gotten a great response on this, and we're really seeing this as a gateway that's accessible for everyone to really look at the healthy building conversation that maybe can lead to a building certification later, but a lot of those building certifications are really out of reach for folks, both tenants and building owners who just don't have the money or time to dedicate to that. And this is a framework people can really use to engage in the conversation. So feel free to check that out if you're interested. I mentioned our talent portal at the beginning of this session here. Again, this is a regional hub for content, for jobs, for employers. You'll find all of our recorded content, including this session we have today, will be up on that website shortly. And then we have a lot of upcoming content here throughout the balance of June and into July around topics like zero waste. And we have some other more fun things like some virtual happy hours and virtual tours. And again, our committees, our members are really the lifeblood of what we do. The ideas and the work that comes out of these committees to move us forward is really inspiring. We hope you find some ways to get involved. And again, MGBCE, this is our big annual conference. We're doing it all digital this year in August. Please join us. We have some great sessions. We have some great speakers we've confirmed. And our theme this year is really equity and has been since the beginning of the year to really speak to some of the issues that we're dealing with now. And if you feel inspired, again, this is free for most folks. Please donate to help support content like this by texting GREEN to 707070. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of our sponsors and partners. Some of them have been here on the session with us today from LADVP or Southern California Edison, but we have a lot of great folks who really support the work that we do on an ongoing basis. So with that, I'm done. I'm happy to shut up and we can all just hang out, have a drink, chat a little bit. I really thank everyone for their time. This has been incredibly educational for me, and I want to pick up some of these threads to make them things that we can advocate on in the region. It's a big part of our role is to do advocacy work, especially for those who can't necessarily advocate for themselves. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time today. If there's any other questions or if anyone wants just to chat, we can do this. I'm here. If not, I know time is our most valuable resource, so you're welcome to go your own way. But thank you to all of our panelists today for taking the time. Ben, is that an Australian accent? Oh, he took off. I was going to ask him about that.
No,
oh, there you are. No, you moved around.
And this is Hillary. I have a question for you. Are you?
Hillary, don't make this. This better be a public consumption question. Let's just be clear.
Yes, exactly. What for a beer, right? I just wanted to ask with the invest plan that right now is in the federal government and they're looking at all the amendments. It's so exciting about what could be the investments in EV infrastructure. And I was just wondering from your panelists how we could be taking advantage of that to really accelerate the infrastructure investments in the ways that you've all been talking about.
I'm not that familiar with the invest plan. Is someone else here on the panel familiar with that?
It's the Invest in America Act. It's the $500 billion surface transportation bill. Yeah.
I have heard of that plan. I didn't know it was just called Invest. Yeah, any panelists here want to comment on that? Do you think it has a high likelihood, Hillary, of moving through to be passed as part of stimulus going forward?
What I've heard is that people see that it has a high likelihood of passing the House, and then that it's going to get rolled into some like $1 trillion plan that the Senate Republicans are going to lead. But that by seeing how much support there is for some of these different platforms, it's going to definitely, have a role to play in how the overall $1 trillion infrastructure bill goes. That's what I've been hearing. But I'd love to hear from this panel because you all know just as much and more.
Hi, Hillary. So if I may just chime in quickly. So I don't know too much about it, but I did hear about the EV portion of this gigantic infrastructure bill. Ben Stapleton and I, we actually spoke with Representative Jimmy Gomez's office in the 34th district just a few weeks ago. And we did tell his chief of staff, we want to support the clean tech community in LA and support the EV inclusion in this act. What she told us was because EV is just a portion of this gigantic bill, it's probably going to be a long times out, at least over 12 months out that we're going to see a resolution. So just in the meantime, we're continuing to support with just lobbying efforts of amplifying voices in our community. But it seems like it's going to be a while until we see something actually happen.
Mm-hmm. I was just encouraged that it's in the section that's like 319 billion. Seems like a great, shot in the arm.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you've seen throughout the history of America, especially right now, if we're talking about investing in infrastructure, I can imagine fewer things than EV that would be more valuable or have a higher return over time, especially in probably medium to heavy duty charging infrastructure. That's the kind of stuff that as a stimulus, what a great way to get that done that puts us 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead of where we need to be, where we're going to get there anyway, and then people are going to struggle to find the capital, right, to make it happen.
Yeah, that's exactly.
So what I will say is when you talk about an influx of money like that, and we've seen it with smaller amounts of pockets of money, what it does, it doesn't just get infrastructure out there, it actually creates companies. So like PCS Energy had not been in EV charging stations 2 years ago, but with LADWP rebate they are. Same with Ariel and Greenwell. So after the money runs out, it's not only does it put infrastructure into the environment, but it has now built these contractors and energy companies that know EV and can continue on with the market that's semi-stimulating itself. So it's always exciting when a ton of money comes in, because it's not just about how far will that money go, it's actually what does it do to the market, and then it becomes a self-sufficient market. So, 5 years ago when I was working with contractors, we had to twist people's arms to come and, represent ChargePoint, go into solicit properties, talk to the Chris and the Jasmines about why you need EV infrastructure and, think about and plan ahead. But now there's more and more of those people. So it would be exciting if that money came out. I don't know how it would look like, how much it would actually reduce the cost for property owners. But with that amount of money, it has so many knock-on effects.
Fantastic.
I'd be curious to see what the chances are of it making it through, particularly in the current climate in an election year. It just seems like I just pulled it out myself because I wasn't familiar with it, and said there's a 2% chance of it being enacted, according to Scopus Labs. I don't know what that means, but it feels probably about
things
right.
have happened recently, Chris.
Right, yeah.
I don't mean to be a pessimist, but it just feels like something that actually does good doesn't necessarily always go through.
Yeah.
I don't want to put Hillary on the spot, but Hillary's actually one of the commissioners for the state of California on the transportation committee. I probably butchered the name of that, but what are you seeing, Hillary, in terms of from a state level? You know, is there a lot of talk specifically around EV infrastructure or charging in general? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I thank you for, I'm the vice chair of the California Transportation Commission. And I think one of the things that has been very exciting with the governor's environmental executive order was he was specifically focusing on how do we get more EV infrastructure into the marketplace, especially a new conversation about how do we start looking at EV trucks along freight corridors. So really looking at where do we charge, how do we charge, what's going to stabilize and enhance the new development along these corridors. And I think, you know, as we are looking at expanding statewide an express lanes network, you know, that is one place where pricing has shown a differentiation and an advantage if you drive an EV vehicle. So it's UCLA did a study that the express lanes and being able to have preferential treatment in the carpool lanes was 40% of people who bought EV vehicles said it was so they could take advantage of those things, not just financial rebates, but the time rebate. So we're looking at investing in more express lanes infrastructure. And I think one of the things that I would like to see this whole group look at is that is going to be a huge incentive for people to buy more EV vehicles and to charge, use that charging. It's a huge incentive.
Hillary, I have a question for you. Also, you should have been a panelist because that was awesome. So right now, the data shows that there's about 300,000 to 400,000 EVs on the road today. And I know that the governor is dealing with getting to 5 million by 2030. So yeah. From a policy perspective, they're saying like a lot of climate policies and environmental policies, the priorities getting shifted as a result of COVID. Are you seeing certain plans change over the upcoming years for specifically EVs?
I think we're actually looking at even more strength of EVs. And in fact, one of the things that the CTC is looking at is partnership with the Public Utilities Commission, because what we want is, and you've talked about it today, is some stability of the utility marketplace so that we can, you know, not be asking for a standard then that, you know, isn't going to be able to be fulfilled by the overall infrastructure. So it's really a big issue. We're not backing away from it at all. This is one of the governor's, you know, pillar points. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have a very robust focus on growing the grid. And I think when, you know, you think about recovering from an economic slowdown, like what could help create more jobs, I think we really want to talk about connecting the economy and the environment and making sure that we are grid ready for all these purchases. And I think one of the other things that people may forget is that a lot of our transportation is funded by sales tax, and there are very few things you can buy other than maybe a boat that generate as much sales tax as buying a vehicle. So it has a nice network effect for everyone if you invest in more EV vehicles.
I think we should have had you as a panelist, Hillary. That was good.
We've got future panels. You know where to find me, Ben.
I do know where to find you. This is true.
Yeah, I was curious.
But I
Hillary,
love these panelists. I gotta say, you guys blew me away.
This is the after panel. This is the after panel.
Exactly.
Chris, go for it.
I was curious, Hillary, with and I saw this kind of pop up in the chat box, and it certainly made me think, you know, as we move to an increased saturation of EV vehicles, obviously there's a corresponding reduction in gas tax. Has there been discussions of how that gets addressed from an infrastructure standpoint, road maintenance? for example?
Yes, there's a lot of work that's been happening on the road user charge, per mile charge. And so it was especially to get at some of these issues. But I think we also have to realize that they're going to be focused on congestion pricing. And again, there's an opportunity to say gas powered vehicles pay X and EV vehicles pay Y. And the other thing about EV infrastructure is, we're advocating for EV buses and an EV streetcar in Los Angeles. There is a lot of opportunity for electric vehicle transit that really is a benefit. And so we certainly support personal vehicles, but there's a lot of opportunity for electric transit that I think is also going to be a huge grid investment and a huge environmental benefit for our region.
I know California is the leader as a state. Is LA, I also believe, is the leader around the country in terms of a major metropolitan area for EV adoption. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And yet, one of the things with the SAFE rule is the issues about the environmental quality, and we still have air quality issues. So what we're hoping is that at post-COVID, when everybody's seeing these blue skies, that they're going to want to continue to see, clean air and look at, where can they invest in cleaner transportation. So they're going to be looking for, new pricing on EV charging for the home, new pricing on EV charging, and EV transit. So this would be a great time if people had a new package of EV charging infrastructure. So you could do a home charger or things. It would be great to put people back to work and also establish this as like another way of doing, house cleaning and air cleaning, investing in things that are going to be healthy and be seen as a way of investing in your healthy communities, as well as investing in healthy buildings through USGBC LA.
Thanks, Hillary. I'm really interested to see too how traffic patterns change, especially as we get back into reentry. As you and I have talked about, I think our hope is that there's still a good portion that's telecommuting, and there's going to be some big impacts to public transit. So I'm kind of curious to see how much of what we've experienced is sticky, and I think we're still just in the beginning days of people figuring out how they're going to handle reentry in a way that's really going to work, right? And I think there'll probably be some pushback for some time. And I'm curious to think about how does that impact the EV world. If coming to your point about 40% of people, or I guess you said, I think it was 40%, were interested in buying just for that sticker. If commuting is less of an issue, does that affect that number? If more people are working at home, does it become easier to buy an EV because they're less worried about range anxiety or workplace charging? I think there's a variety of factors that sort of play into that.
Mm-hmm. You're right. And I think EV fleets that are going to be for car share and carpooling are going to be really the new thing, because people do want to come to work, but they don't want to go to work alone. And I know a number of companies that are going to do EV car share and just EV TNCs specifically to give people that ability to travel clean and travel less in their own vehicle.
Yeah, we're for sure seeing that on the multifamily side, an increased interest in the car sharing in particular. And I'm sure COVID has highlighted that a little bit, but just I don't really need to own a car. I mean, whenever I buy this asset that sits really in one place 90% of the time, it is probably the second biggest investment that I make. And I really, if there's good public transportation, there's probably only a few trips. I mean, maybe the Target's on the wrong side of where public transportation goes. So maybe once a week I need to go over there, but it's not honestly an every single daily need as like it used to be. And I get, and I run into this a lot in Texas and other places where they are very car dependent and they don't have the infrastructure to support it. But I see that particularly like in the Bay Area and in LA, where this car sharing is really becoming a big deal, even in Seattle and on the East Coast a little bit. So I think, and even for like building owners like us, that's an amenity. That does become an amenity, because now I have a product on site, and kind of like to David's point earlier about capacity and what you do with those chargers and that type of stuff. Hey, you know what? If all my chargers are not being used right now for charging, maybe I throw a car share in there for a while and
Right.
And provide a service to the tenants. So
Well,
it's kind of an interesting dynamic.
You're right. And I think that, SB 743 implementation is supposed to start July 1st in California. So every new building is going to be very incentivized in the construction process is going to be very incentivized to reduce their vehicle miles traveled. So car share is going to be a huge asset, and carpooling is going to be a huge asset. And so it's going to have a big, profound effect on this conversation.
Awesome. Well, Hillary, I think we should have you join every after panel. I think it seems just the after panel featuring Hillary Norton going forward. I know we're at 6 o'clock, so I appreciate everyone's time. This has been really informative. I've learned a lot, and I'd be curious to see too, Hillary, how we start to see, as that regulation kicks in July 1st.
Yep.
Is it really going to be, implemented in terms of follow up and making sure people are kind of held to their feet to the fire? We'll see.
Good point.
Hillary,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for a fascinating day.
Go ahead, Ariel. Go ahead.
Hillary, do you have any advice on how people can keep up with the CTC's enforcement and also rollout of these different EV mandates?
Well, we don't enforce it. It's CARB, but we just fund various projects related to it. So it's CARB. But I would tell you that we're going to have in July a meeting with CARB and CTC, and then the HCD, Housing and Community Development. And that's going to be a big, tentpole about the new normal under COVID, and then what that kind of enforcement, what that rollout is going to look like. So I would encourage you guys all to be part of that.
Cool. Thanks for everything you shared in this after call.
Sure. Well, anything for Ben. We are partners on a number of things, and anything for Ben. So I have to go,
Hillary,
but
you
it was
got a permanent
great
invitation, so thank you. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening, and we'll see you soon. Stay safe out there.